probably familiar with the way in which professors like to enlighten you about the origin of things. I want to talk a few moments about the word to suffer, since we've been talking about suffering. And I want to enlighten you by telling you that our verb to suffer comes from the Latin verb suffero, meaning to suffer. But if you look at suffero a little bit, you do get a little more information. It comes from two Latin words, one sub, meaning under, and one fero, meaning to bear. So if we had in English the verb to underbear, we would all immediately know what suffering meant, but we don't. The nearest equivalent we have is to undergo. To suffer is to undergo something. Now, we use this word suffer in three different ways, which all of you are familiar with, but you may never have thought about it, stepped back to realize there are three different ways in which we talk about suffering. And I wanted very briefly to indicate each of those three ways because they're going to come up in the talk that I want to give. And the first way is we use it in the sense of self-restraint. Not exercising a power we have the right to exercise, but choose not to because we think some greater good will be realized by restraining ourselves. So when Jesus tells parents and guardians, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not," that's what he's talking to parents and guardians who are given by God the authority over their children, the right to say this you may do and this you may not do. But in my case, says Jesus, don't use that authority to forbid, but permit them to come. Suffer the little children to come unto me. And this kind of suffering, the permission, the exercise of your authority in such a way as to restrain it, this is the only way in which God the Father can suffer. As Derek was saying in his talk, God is all action. It's all outflow. Nothing comes back to God. There's no pushback from us to God the Father, because the very pushback that we would give, God sustains by his creative energy. So this is something you may want to argue about. Theologians have a big word for it. They call it impassibility. Because that's another Latin word that means suffering. Patior is another verb from which we get patient. A patient is somebody who undergoes a treatment. Right? We get passive from that. That's somebody who is being acted upon, hasn't the strength to act against or to stop this action. And also passionate we get from that other Latin word. When you're passionate when your emotions are in control of you and you're not in control of them, right? That's what it is to be passionate. So self-restraint is the only way that God suffers, and it is the grandest way in which we suffer. When we rightly exercise our judgment about whether we should step forward and intervene or step back and let it happen. When we rightly exercise our judgment, we come as close to God the Father as we can come in our actions. That is what human wisdom consists of. Now, the second kind of passion or suffering is being acted upon or constrained. And this is something we can't control. This happens because we're finite beings with finite amounts of power. Nature can deal us a very hard hand in birth. Nature can do this suddenly in the form of an earthquake or a flood. Other human beings can cause us to suffer, and we talked yesterday, there were all those wonderful talks about people who have gravely suffered in this way of being acted upon against their will. And this too has many biblical sources. I'll give one, 2 Corinthians 1:6. If we are afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation, which is effectual in enduring the same sufferings which we also suffer. It's good for you to suffer. And so the third meaning, very briefly, is a hybrid case. This is the case where we allow something to happen, not to other people, like our children, but to us. Now, there are trivial cases where we do this. We suffer when we go to the dentist. We willingly suffer. We allow a treatment to be given to us which we wouldn't otherwise have chosen, but we allow it with calculation to the future. In fact, somebody else in a talk, I can't remember which talk, mentioned this. Because you think it would be better to suffer a little bit now and avoid future suffering that would be much more, you allow the dentist to do his work. So this is arguably the only way in which Jesus suffers. I say it's arguable. It may not be correct, but we can talk about it again in the question and answer if anybody wants to raise this question. But Jesus does tell his disciples in John 10:18, when he's just preparing them for what's going to happen, he says, "No man takes my life away from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." Right? So that's exactly that kind of suffering. He decides, he has the authority, of course, over the world. He could have stopped at any moment the story that Derek was telling us about. He could have stopped that, but he didn't. He allowed it to happen. No man took it from him. He gave it. So this is also the way Christians are called to suffer. Peter says in 1 Peter 2:21, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his footsteps." Okay, so just those three things, and now I can get to my talk, and I hope I don't go over time as a result of having talked about this word. So my topic is the suicide of the West. It's a topical thing to talk about, much discussed by those of us prone to apocalyptic premonitions. I'd like to discuss it in connection with suffering, and also with the related ideas of tragedy and comedy, which were the subjects of my earlier talk. At the end of that talk, I reminded you about how, with the Enlightenment, dark fantasies about human life returned to Western thought, eventually giving birth to our own secular, materialistic, naturalistic thinking, upon which the tragic view of life once more exerts its gravitational attraction. Existentialists tell us that life is absurd. Positivists think it is a dance of the atoms, ending in cosmic exhaustion. Naturalism burdens our spirits with disenchantment. The Enlightenment also invented atheism in its modern sense. This is something many people don't realize. Atheism, as we understand it, is a very recent thing. And it's the view that there is no God to save us. That's very new. How is this view holding up centuries after the Enlightenment? Contemporary atheism presents to us a world evolved into its present form by purely natural causes. These causes themselves held in place by unchanging laws of nature. Here's how Bertrand Russell, probably the most famous English language, anyway, atheistic philosopher of the 20th century, here's how he expressed the Enlightenment's legacy now almost 100 years ago. I think it was 1917 he wrote these words. "Amid such a world," that is, the evolved world with its laws that I've just mentioned, "amid such a world, if anywhere, our ideals henceforward must find a home. That man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. That no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual beyond the grave. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion and inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth safely be built. It's very hard to see how anything uplifting could be built within so inhospitable a scaffolding, by men and women who are themselves produced by the same laws that govern the unfriendly world they inhabit. But some sincere and careful atheistic thinkers look for sprouts of consolation even on this stony ground. Let me read you what an Oxford Don called Richard Robinson offered his students and readers in the way of encouragement half a century after Russell's book. This is what Robinson says: "When we contemplate the friendless position of man in the universe, as it is right sometimes to do, our attitude should be the tragic poet's affirmation of man's ideals of behavior. Our dignity and our finest occupation is to maintain our self-chosen goods as long as we can, those great goods of beauty, virtue, and truth. And among the virtues, it is proper to mention in this connection, above all, the virtues of courage and love. There is no person in this universe to love us except ourselves. Therefore, let us love one another. The human race is alone, but individual men need not be alone because we have each other. We are brothers without a father. Let us all the more, for that, behave brotherly to one another. The finest achievement for humanity is to recognize our predicament, including our insecurity and our coming extinction, and to maintain our cheerfulness and love and decency in spite of it. To prosecute our ideals in spite of it. We have good things to contemplate and high things to do. Let us do them." Now, I admire Robinson for the noble things to which he exhorts us. But are they not found wanting when weighed in the scale with his description of our situation? Friendless, tragic, alone, unloved, fatherless, insecure, and doomed. If this is what we are, and the same universe made us as threatens us with our doom, how can we, any more than King Laius of old, look forward to anything but annihilation? Still, Russell and Robinson are philosophers doing what philosophers ought to do. They are trying to look with courage and integrity at the world as they think it is, and as it would be if there were no God. If the world were as barren, stingy, and adversarial as they suppose, then their attitude, pathetic as it is, would be the noblest possible. It has about it the futile greatness of the French nobility, who cried out, "Long live the king!" just before the blade of the guillotine chopped their heads from their shoulders. Russell's and Robinson's depiction of the human condition finds an audience in the narrow circle of secular people, of disciplined and honest minds, prepared to view with detachment the prospect of a hopeless life. but they are very few. Most secularists prefer to close their ears to such discouraging talk and cast about desperately for alternatives. To paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, when people cease to believe in God, they grasp at straws. When told from an early age there is no cosmic lover or savior, our immense and unquenchable craving for love and salvation drives us elsewhere, anywhere, demanding to be met. We turn to gurus and ashrams, Satanism and terrorism, cults and collectives. We turn to nonsense of any kind. But I would like to talk about serious ideas today. Let's stick with the few secularists who are disciplined, thoughtful, and honest. Even they, however, seek guidance, and they often seek it from the sciences. But because moral or spiritual guidance cannot be found in science, what those who seek guidance there end up with is scientism, the attribution of authority to science in domains it does not even understand. Scientism is the de facto guiding principle of Western civilization today. We understand the human condition to be whatever the natural and social sciences say it is. The best practice to adopt in light of our condition, we think, is whatever practices these same sciences recommend. Scientific theory and scientistic practice meet in politics, in the formulation of laws and public policies. Here we reason together about what we ought to do as beings left alone, unloved, and without direction. When we reason together in this way, the concept of suffering is always at hand. In the scientific discourse of today, our world is neither good nor bad. It consists of interacting bodies, each acting upon and suffering from the others. Born of the world, we resemble the world, apt subjects for the discourse of calculation, but not of moral discourse. Though we have purposes as individuals and may espouse principles to further the interest of groups to which we belong, from the cosmic point of view, we and all our groups are little, transient, pointless, and purposeless things. Our fellow creatures, though necessary for our survival, are not there to help us. They compete with us for the basic necessities of life. Wisdom, therefore, dictates that we use our scientific knowledge and the power it gives us over nature to make the world as favorable as possible to our own flourishing. Flourishing here means physical health, mental health, and material prosperity. Moral considerations seldom figure meaningfully in political deliberations about human well-being. What does figure is suffering and how to avoid it. Here are some examples of how political policies are debated in the public sphere. Environmentalism. Too great an emphasis on our dependence on nature will lead to a form of environmental extremism, sometimes called deep ecology. I always have to chuckle about the idea that it's deep. But anyway, that's what it's often called, in which our own happiness is sacrificed for the presumed good of the environment. This we must avoid. On the other hand, too little emphasis on our dependence on nature will lead to excessive exploitation of nature and create a toxic environment, which we must also avoid. Next topic, use of drugs. Remove all stigma from the use of drugs, make them easily available, and social entropy will soon make us uncompetitive in the world. Declare a total war on drugs, however, and we will only enrich the cartels and gangs that distribute drugs illegally and gladly with murderous efficacy. Next topic, globalization. By exporting the production of goods to the third world, we can reap the advantage of low labor costs in countries that are not scrupulous about whom they employ or how their employees live. But that creates loss of employment at home. What use are low prices to a domestic market with no disposable income? However, if we therefore encourage local industries and fair wages, the cost of living will inevitably go up. So, environment, drugs, globalization. 3 questions of public policy. My characterization of the debate about these issues is a simplification, of course, but not, I think, a caricature. What I want to bring out is their similarity. They share a binary logic. Each posits a continuum of possible responses between 2 undesirable extremes. Each weighs the comparative payoff of increasing a certain sort of flourishing or decreasing a kind of suffering. Each debate is conducted without reference to moral questions, other than the question of our own flourishing or suffering, as reductive scientism understands it, in crudely calculating non-moral terms. All 3 of my examples share another similarity. In each case, one of the undesirable extremes is associated mainly with the political left, the other mainly with the political right. A final interesting thing to observe is that churches, for the most part, do not provide a bulwark of opposition to this secular way of posing and answering such questions. Instead, the churches themselves are split, like the rest of the population, along ideological lines. No doubt in any congregation there will be 1 or 2 who deplore the scientistic tenor of public debate, but they are not representative of the congregation. They do not even represent church leaders. The binary simplicity of these debates comes from their unquestioning regard for human material flourishing, from their deafness to religious and moral considerations, and from the agreement of all parties that material flourishing is life's chief good. Put another way, all parties agree that bodily or psychological suffering is always to be avoided. Governments are unanimous on this. Left and right sing from the same page. Pagan and churchman agree. But according to Orthodox Christian thinkers like Boethius and Leibniz, whom I discussed in my earlier paper, suffering is not always best avoided, nor is material prosperity always to be sought. Christian thinkers see suffering and prosperity differently because they are aware of this world's moral dimension. Leibniz thinks ours is the best possible world, but still acknowledges that it is everywhere saturated with suffering and evil, just as the most brightly sunlit forest is the most deeply streaked with shade. I began this lecture with the 3 meanings of our word suffering. The first was self-restraint, permitting certain things to take place that are not necessarily bad or good in themselves. And it's the meaning in which we have the power and authority to stop something, but we think it will lead to greater good if we let it proceed. For example, we used to allow competitions in classrooms in which all children would compete and one would take the prize. But not today. In today's school, every child must be a winner. The momentary suffering of defeat is rejected. The development of sportsmanship, self-reliance, and character that defeats begin to engender in those who fall short is sacrificed. Even momentary suffering is intolerable to us today, even if moral benefit will arise from it. What I am holding up for scrutiny here is the zero-tolerance attitude towards suffering that characterizes secular scientific thought. I'm not, however, expecting to persuade any secular scientific thinker of its folly. It is precisely in their attitude of zero tolerance towards suffering that secular scientism believes itself superior to Christianity. G.K. Chesterton noticed this a century ago and quipped that the secular mind is guided by Christian virtues gone mad. What an interesting idea, that secular attitudes are madly distorted versions of Christian beliefs. So let me give a couple of examples of the kind of thing Chesterton meant. Christians are commanded to care for the stranger. In Germany and Southern Europe today, and to a frightening degree also in Canada, our immigration policies more than fulfill Christ's command. We care so well for the stranger and for so many strangers that we risk, in effect, becoming strangers in our own land. We are also told in the gospel to care for the poor, and we do. All our utopian schemes for making poverty history attempt literally to love the poor to death. Both provincial and federal parties in Canada have recently considered abolishing the poor altogether by bringing in a minimum basic income, resting on the principle of infinite borrowing from our future. The advocates of this project plan to continue borrowing until we have no more future to borrow from, and all of us are poor. Or what about this example? In Christ there is no male or female. But that's even more true with us. Though we love copulation, we hate the very thought of there being two sexes. The very ideas of male and female are odious to us with their sexism. In their place, we put scores of genders, and anyone can drift in and out of them as he pleases. In Christ, women in their differences from men became men's equals. Christianity recognized the dignity of women, their ability to bear children, to educate and civilize them, and to tame in marriage the sexual and professional ambitions of men. Radical feminism does better. It has liberated women from their nature, from men, and from marriage. It loves them so much as to free them altogether from children, permitting them even to scrape away any children they find in their womb, without owing an account of their actions to anyone. The church founded universities and created the idea of professional education for lawyers, doctors, and religious. But that was elitist. To enter university, you had to have Latin in those days, along with intellectual gifts and self-discipline. We secularists have opened universities to everyone, with the result, of course, that standards decline to meet the level of the students, that everyone obtains a degree, and that the marketplace therefore assigns to our degrees the same value as it does to other things that are easily and everywhere available, such as pretty pebbles and used bicycles. A conglomerate of for-profit law schools provides an instructive, well-documented example of how the secular world loves disadvantaged people. In the United States, in the early years of the new millennium, loans for graduate students were made larger and easier to get. These changes were presented to the public as ways of enabling even disadvantaged young people to afford university education, and through education to rise, even from the ghetto, to lucrative careers in law. Paul Campos, a law professor at the University of Colorado, describes the changes as follows in an article called The Law School Scam. It's from the Atlantic Monthly, September 2014, but it's still available online if you ever want to look it up. The Law School Scam. So he describes these changes in the law in these words. Perhaps the most important change was an extension in 2006 of the federal Direct Plus loan program, which allowed any graduate student admitted to an accredited program to borrow the full cost of attendance, tuition plus living expenses, directly from the federal government. The most striking feature of the Direct Plus loan program is that it limits neither the amount a school can charge for attendance nor the amount that can be borrowed in federal funds. That's amazing, eh? I can charge you as much as I want, you can borrow as much as you want. It's a little bit unfair, the balance there, but it looks good, it sounded good. Campus goes on to provide a further illustration of how much more we secularists love the poor than the Christians ever did. Moreover, he says there is little oversight on the part of the lender, in effect, us, taxpayers. There's little oversight on the part of the lender regarding whether the students taking out these loans have any reasonable prospect of ever paying them back. We don't worry much today about paying back loans. It's an onerous and unpleasant thing to do. Taking loans is an excellent way of banishing material suffering today. And as for the material suffering repaying them may inflict on us tomorrow, the day of reckoning may never come. No Western nation today, probably no nation in the world, will ever pay its debts. Many private citizens are indebted far beyond their ability to pay, and life goes on. Why should it be different for student debts? The compassionate and generous consideration showed to poor and downtrodden young people by the US government brought other compassionate and generous souls into the law school market. Where medieval Christians made law degrees available to the educable few, these new philanthropists opened for-profit law schools to every credulous being they could lure with the promise of a career in law, including people so disadvantaged, so desperate, so badly raised, and badly educated, or so weak-minded as to be unable to pass the bar admission exam. With government money, these ineducables are invited to pay tuition as high as the market will bear, to run up debts of between $200,000 and $300,000. American, that's not Canadian dollars. It's 100 times that in our pesos here. And then to face job expectations no better and sometimes worse than they would have faced had they gone into the workforce immediately after high school. Public universities are following in the footsteps of nonprofit schools as fast as they can. As another writer put it, they have deprioritized education and prioritized business administration. A pleasurable way to get the full and even more disturbing details of the law school scam is to read the slightly fictionalized account of it in John Grisham's recent novel, Rooster Bar. A unifying characteristic of the examples I've been discussing, attitudes toward immigration, competition, drugs, or disadvantaged people, is that there is no requirement of self-restraint in the use of public resources to alleviate perceived material suffering, nor do we ask for self-restraint in those we make eligible for our help. Yet self-restraint, that's the first of the three meanings I talked about, self-restraint is the measure of moral excellence. It's the first meaning of the verb to suffer. When self-restraint goes mad, everything is permitted, depleting the revenues of the state and the character of its citizens. The secular mind fares no better in regard to the second kind of suffering, the external pains or disasters that come to us uninvited. To the secular mind, they are the enemy. The good life consists not in confronting them with courage and integrity, but in keeping them at bay. In my experience, this secular attitude has also colonized the minds of many Christians. One indication is the way in which we have lost our ear for the kind of devotional poetry which used to be the staple of hymn books, Sunday school lessons, and devotional writing, such as this. Suffering is the work now sent. All my powers to this are bent. Suffering is my gain. I bow. Suffering is my worship now. Or this, God's ways are not as our ways. His thoughts are not as ours. He wounds us sore with cruel thorns when we have stooped for flowers. But oh, 'tis from the oft-pierced heart those precious drops distill, that many a life, else all unblessed, with healing balm shall fill. Or this, take my nature's strength away, every comfort, every stay, every hindrance of thy love, all my power to act or move. Fain I would be truly still, fain I would be without will, simple, innocent, and free, free from all that is not thee. The only kind of suffering the secular mind can tolerate is the third kind, the hybrid case in which we allow something or someone else to inflict suffering on us. But this will be allowed only as a calculated risk, only when the payoff is a material one and comes directly to ourselves. It must be as straightforward as a dental appointment, where by a simple and certain calculation, we can see that momentary physical suffering will free us from undergoing greater suffering of that kind in the future. I pointed out earlier that the important sufferings of Christ were all of this third kind. And that's true, except that in him there was no calculation of risk and no requirement of future material payoff. And secondly, Christ suffered voluntarily, not for his own benefit, but for ours. Not to flee as much suffering as possible, but to take every bit of it, yours, mine, and everybody else's, upon himself. If Christ's story had ended on Good Friday, as his disciples initially thought it had, it would have been a tragic life. It would have been the model of a tragic life because the best of men would have been destroyed in the cruelest and most arbitrary manner. But with the resurrected Christ came the resurrection of the kingdom of God. As Julian of Norwich said, it proves that all things will be well, and all manner of things will be well. That light still burns in these dark times. It's the only story that puts in question whether the West's moral suicide will lead to tragic disintegration. Certainly, the secular scientific outlook of our time is one of despair, the deadliest of deadly sins, and often the gateway to suicide. But because Christ rose from the dead, it is not impossible that the West may find him again and rise from its own deathbed. That is a comedy some of us may live long enough to see. Thank you.